Chapter 1. A Bookshop Owner's Nightmare. The letter arrived on a day much like any other in my life. Overcast, steeped in the familiar scent of dust and old paper that clung to everything within the walls of my antique bookstore, curios and conundrums. I, Elias Thorne, proprietor and purveyor of forgotten tailies and forgotten things, considered myself a man of the mundane, despite being surrounded by the extraordinary remnants of other lives. I was wrong, of course. As I soon learned, the mundane is often a thin veil over the abyss. The envelope was unremarkable cream-colored, thick stock, addressed in elegant, looping script that seemed almost Victorian in its formality. No return address. Curiosity, a constant companion in my line of work, nudged me to open it. Inside, a single sheet of paper contained only a few lines. Elias Thorne. Whisperwind asylum calls. Its secrets yearn to be told. A darkness sleeps there waiting for a voice. You are that voice. Come soon. The signature was simply a friend. A friend. I had no friends who wrote in such melodramatic fashion. More likely, a prank or perhaps someone mistaking me for another Elias Thorne. Yet the words resonated with an unsettling familiarity. I had heard whispers of Whisperwind Asylum before, a place shrouded in local legend and whispered rumors of unspeakable horrors. Whisperwind Asylum. It stood, or rather, stood as it had been abandoned some 50 years prior, a crumbling edifice on a windswept moor in the desolate expanse of the North Yorkshire moors. It had been a place of healing, or so the official story went, a retreat for the mentally unwell. The truth, as it often does, was far darker. Stories circulated of experimental procedures, inhumane treatment, and a pervasive sense of dread that had permeated the very stones of the building. The asylum had been shut down after a series of unexplained deaths and a public outcry over the conditions within. Now, it was simply a decaying landmark, a skeletal silhouette against the unforgiving sky. I considered dismissing the letter. It was likely nonsense, a misguided attempt to draw me into some local ghost hunt. I was a bookseller, not a paranormal investigator, but something about the tone, the urgency, and the specific mention of being a voice for its secrets tugged at me. I had always been drawn to the untold stories, the hidden narratives that lingered beneath the surface of history. Perhaps this was one such story waiting to be unearthed. The more I pondered, the more the pull became irresistible. A sense of morbid fascination, coupled with the professional itch to uncover a new and compelling tale, overcame my skepticism. I decided to go. The drive was long and arduous. The North Yorkshire moors were a landscape of brooding beauty, but also of profound desolation. Heather-covered hills stretched as far as the eye could see, punctuated by craggy outcrops and the occasional windswept tree. The sky was a perpetual gray, casting long, eerie shadows across the moor. As I drove deeper, a sense of isolation descended, a feeling of being utterly alone in a vast and uncaring wilderness. The directions I found, cobbled together from local folklore websites and old maps, led me down ever-narrowing roads, eventually turning into a rutted track that seemed barely passable. My small car groaned in protest as I navigated the uneven terrain. The air grew colder, the wind stronger, whipping around the car with an almost malevolent force. Finally, on the crest of a particularly bleak hill, I saw it. Whisperwind Asylum. Even from a distance, it was a sight to inspire dread. A massive Gothic structure built of dark, weathered stone, it loomed against the horizon like a decaying cathedral. The windows were empty sockets, staring out into the moor with a vacant, accusing gaze. Parts of the roof had collapsed, and ivy clung to the walls like grasping fingers. It was a monument to despair, a testament to the dark secrets it held within. I parked the car on a patch of uneven ground, the wind buffeting the vehicle with startling force. Stepping out, I was immediately assailed by the cold, damp air and the mournful howl of the wind. It seemed to whisper secrets in my ear, unintelligible murmurs that sent a shiver down my spine. As I approached the asylum, the scale of its decay became even more apparent. The once grand entrance was now a gaping maw, the doors long gone, the stone archway crumbling. Graffiti marred the walls, crude symbols and obscene messages scrawled by vandals over the years. But even these acts of defacement couldn't diminish the overwhelming sense of oppressive history that clung to the place. I hesitated at the entrance, a sense of foreboding washing over me. This was not just an abandoned building, it was a place of profound suffering, a repository of dark memories. Yet I could not turn back. The pull was too strong, the desire to uncover the truth too compelling. Taking a deep breath, I stepped inside. The interior was even more desolate than I had imagined. The entrance hall, once likely imposing and ornate, was now a scene of utter ruin. Plaster peeled from the walls, revealing the brick beneath. The floor was littered with debris, broken glass, fallen ceiling tiles, and the detritus of years of neglect. The air was thick with the smell of damp, mold, and something else. Something indefinably wrong. A faint, metallic tang like old blood. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the grime-covered windows, casting long, distorted shadows that danced across the walls. The wind howled through the broken panes, creating an eerie chorus of moans and whispers. It was as if the asylum itself was crying out in pain. I pulled out my flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom. The entrance hall opened onto a network of corridors, each branching off into the depths of the building. I could hear the faint sound of dripping water echoing through the silence. Which way to go? I had no map, no guide, only the cryptic message that had brought me here. Whisperwind Asylum calls. Its secrets yearn to be told. Where would those secrets be found? I closed my eyes, trying to sense something, anything that might guide me. The wind howled, the shadows danced, and the air crackled with an unseen energy. Then I heard it. A faint whisper, barely audible above the wind. It seemed to come from the end of the corridor to my left. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, a plea, a lament, a cry for help. My heart pounded in my chest. Was it real? Or was it just the wind playing tricks on my ears? I didn't know, but I had to investigate. I started down the corridor, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The air grew colder, the whispers louder. The walls seemed to close in around me, the shadows growing darker and more menacing. As I reached the end of the corridor, I saw it. A door, slightly ajar, with a sliver of light escaping from within. The whispers were coming from behind that door. Taking a deep breath, I pushed it open. The room was small and bare, a former patient's cell, perhaps. A single window, boarded up from the outside, allowed only a faint glimmer of light to penetrate. The walls were covered in scratches, crude drawings, and indecipherable writing. The floor was stained with what looked like dried blood. In the center of the room, a figure sat huddled on the floor. A woman, dressed in a tattered white gown, her face hidden by long, tangled hair. She was rocking back and forth, muttering to herself. "Hello," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "Are you all right?" The woman didn't respond. She continued to rock and mutter, her voice a low, unintelligible drone. I took a step closer, my flashlight beam illuminating her face. It was a young face, but etched with lines of pain and despair. Her eyes were wide and vacant, staring into some unseen horror. "Can you hear me?" I asked, my voice louder now. "My name is Elias. I'm here to help." The woman stopped rocking. Slowly, she raised her head and looked at me. Her eyes, once vacant, now flickered with a spark of recognition. You heard it," she whispered, her voice raspy and weak. "Heard what?" I asked. "The whispers," she said. "They called you, didn't they?" I nodded. "Yes, I received a letter." "The whispers, they never stop," she said, her voice filled with despair. "They tell of what happened here, what they did to us." "Who are you?" I asked. "What happened here?" The woman hesitated. Her eyes darted around the room as if she were afraid of being overheard. Then she leaned closer to me and whispered, My name is Alina, and this is where they broke us." And so my descent into the abyss began. Chapter 2: Echoes of Alina. Alina's words hung in the air, thick with the weight of unspoken horrors. Broke us. A simple phrase, yet it painted a vivid picture of the suffering that had permeated these walls. I had come seeking a story, but I was beginning to realize that I had stumbled into something far more profound and far more dangerous. "Who broke you, Alina?" I asked, keeping my voice gentle. "Who did this to you?" Alina flinched as if struck. "The doctors," she whispered, her eyes widening with terror. "The monsters in white coats. They came at night with their needles and their knives. They wanted to fix us, they said, but they only broke us more." Her words were disjointed, fragmented, like shards of a shattered mirror reflecting a distorted reality. I suspected that years of trauma and isolation had taken their toll on her mind. Still, beneath the surface of her madness, I sensed a core of truth, a desperate plea to be heard. "What did they do, Alina?" I pressed gently. "Can you tell me?" Alina hesitated, her body trembling. It was clear that reliving these memories was excruciating for her, but I also sensed that she desperately needed to speak, to unburden herself of the secrets she had carried for so long. They experimented on us," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They tried to change us, to erase the things they didn't understand. They used electricity and drugs and things I can't even remember." She clutched her head, as if trying to block out the images that were flooding her mind. I could see the pain etched on her face, the raw, unadulterated suffering that had become her constant companion. There was Dr. Albright, she continued, her voice gaining a slight edge of bitterness. He was the worst. He was obsessed with finding the cure for madness. He thought he could unlock the secrets of the brain, control the human mind. He saw us as lab rats to be dissected and analyzed. Dr. Albright. The name was vaguely familiar. I seemed to recall reading about him in some of the historical records I had consulted before coming here. He had been the chief physician at Whisperwind Asylum during its final years, a controversial figure known for his radical and often inhumane methods. "What did Dr. Albright do to you, Alina?" I asked, steeling myself for what I was about to hear. Alina's eyes glazed over as if she were reliving the horrors in her mind's eye. He used me for his experiments," she whispered. "He wanted to see how far he could push the human mind, how much pain it could endure. He subjected me to treatments that were beyond cruel. He electrocuted me, he drugged me, he even performed surgery on my brain." Her words were like a punch to the gut. I had heard stories of the brutal practices employed in asylums of the past, but to hear them recounted firsthand, to see the visible scars of those horrors on Alina's face, was truly sickening. "He carved me open," she said, touching her temple lightly. "He didn't care. I told him to stop, but he just laughed and carried on. The pain, my mind became so empty. It all disappeared, all except the whispers." "Surgery?" I asked, my voice incredulous. "What kind of surgery?" Alina stared into the distance. "He called it a lobotomy," she whispered. "He said it would cure me of my hysteria. But it only made things worse. It took away my memories, my emotions, my very self. Now I'm just an empty shell, haunted by the whispers of the past." Lobotomy. The word sent a chill down my spine. It was a barbaric procedure, a crude attempt to sever the connections in the brain and supposedly cure mental illness. In reality, it often left patients with profound cognitive and emotional deficits, turning them into vacant, unresponsive shells of their former selves. To think that Dr. Albright had performed this procedure on Alina, turning her into the broken woman she was today, filled me with a righteous anger. But I knew that anger would not help her. I needed to remain calm, to gain her trust, to uncover the full extent of the horrors that had taken place within these walls. "Alina," I said, taking her hand, "I believe you. I believe what happened to you was wrong, and I want to help you tell your story. I want to expose the truth about what happened at Whisperwind Asylum." Alina looked at me, her eyes searching my face. You really mean that?" she asked, her voice filled with a mixture of hope and skepticism. "I do," I said, squeezing her hand. "I'm a writer, Alina. I tell stories, and your story deserves to be told." A faint smile flickered across Alina's face. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for listening." We sat in silence for a few moments, the only sound the mournful howl of the wind and the faint dripping of water. I could feel the weight of Alina's suffering, the years of pain and isolation that had shaped her into the woman she was today. "Where do we start, Alina?" I asked. "What do you want me to know?" Alina closed her eyes as if gathering her thoughts. "Start with the whispers," she said. "They know everything. They'll guide you to the truth." "The whispers?" I asked. "What do you mean?" The voices, Eleanor said. The voices of the patients who died here. They linger in the walls, in the floors, in the very air. They speak to those who are willing to listen. They tell of the horrors that were committed here, the secrets that have been buried for so long. I hesitated. I had always been a skeptic, a man of reason and logic. But here, in this desolate asylum, surrounded by the echoes of suffering, I found myself questioning everything I had ever believed. How do I hear them, Eleanor? I asked. How do I listen to the whispers? Eleanor opened her eyes and looked at me intently. You have to be open, she said. You have to quiet your mind, silence your doubts, and allow the whispers to enter. They'll come to you when you're ready. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I understood what she meant. What do I do then? I asked. They'll guide you, Eleanor said. They'll show you the places where the worst things happened. They'll tell you the stories that need to be told. Just listen and trust what they say. It was a strange and unsettling proposition. To rely on the voices of the dead, to trust in the whispers of a haunted asylum. But I had come this far. I had heard Eleanor's story, seen the pain in her eyes. I owed it to her, and to the other victims of Whisperwind Asylum, to uncover the truth, no matter how strange or unsettling the path might be. All right, Eleanor, I said. I'll listen to the whispers. I'll follow their guidance. I'll do whatever it takes to tell your story. Eleanor smiled, a genuine smile this time that lit up her face and banished the shadows from her eyes. Thank you, Elias, she said. Thank you for giving us a voice. With that, she closed her eyes and fell silent, as if she had exhausted all her remaining energy. I knew that she was entrusting me with a great responsibility, a burden that would likely weigh heavily on my soul, but I was ready to accept it. I stood up, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The room felt different now somehow. The air was still cold and damp, but the oppressive sense of dread had lifted slightly, replaced by a sense of purpose. I was no longer just a bookseller seeking a story. I was a vessel for the voices of the dead, a conduit for the truth, and I was determined to fulfill my mission, no matter what horrors I might uncover along the way. Taking a deep breath, I stepped out of Eleanor's cell and into the darkness of Whisperwind Asylum, ready to listen to the whispers and follow their guidance wherever they might lead. The true story of Whisperwind was ready to be told. The silence would soon be broken. Chapter 3: The Chapel of Lost Souls. The corridor, once a passage for the hopeful, now felt like a tomb. The air thrummed with a palpable silence, punctuated only by the rhythmic drip of water and the ceaseless howl of the wind. Eleanor's words echoed in my mind. The whispers. They'll guide you to the truth. As I stood there trying to quiet my mind, a faint, almost imperceptible sound reached my ears. It was a melodic hum, a somber and ethereal tune that seemed to emanate from the depths of the asylum. The music grew stronger, drawing me forward. It was a chorus of voices, faint yet undeniably present, weaving through the darkness like threads of spectral silk. The whispers. I followed the sound, my flashlight beam dancing along the decaying walls. The corridor twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the labyrinthine structure. I passed crumbling offices, abandoned treatment rooms, and cells that mirrored the desolate one I'd just left. The whispers grew in intensity with each step, forming discernible words, fragments of prayers and desperate cries. The voices of the lost. The voices led me to a large, arched doorway. Sunlight streamed through the shattered, stained glass windows that adorned the front of the building. I recognized it immediately. The asylum's chapel. The interior of the chapel was a scene of magnificent decay. The high vaulted ceiling was adorned with intricate carvings, now covered in dust and cobwebs. The pews, once meticulously arranged, were overturned and broken. The altar, a marble masterpiece, was cracked and stained. The music intensified, a haunting hymn, a chorus of lost souls lamenting their fate. I could feel their presence, a palpable weight in the air, a symphony of grief and despair. It was a chorus that stirred a deep, primordial fear within me, a fear that I would be consumed by the weight of their sorrow. Hesitantly, I stepped inside. The stained glass windows, though shattered, still cast vibrant hues across the floor, painting the scene in a kaleidoscope of color and shadow. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light, creating an ethereal atmosphere. As I moved closer to the altar, the whispers grew louder. I began to make out individual voices, distinct fragments of conversations and confessions. There were men, women, and even children, each with their own story of suffering and loss. Forgive us, Father. They took my mind. I just wanted to be loved. It hurts so much. The voices formed a chorus, a tapestry of pain, and I felt the tears welling up in my eyes. I focused my attention on the altar where a single object rested. It was a small, leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age. I approached the altar, the whispers urging me closer. Carefully, I picked up the book. The cover was embossed with a golden cross, and the title read, Confessions of Whisperwind. I opened the book and the whispers intensified. The pages were filled with handwritten entries, detailed accounts of the patients' lives, their treatments, and their darkest secrets. As I read, a chilling story began to unfold. The first entry was from a young woman named Eliza, who had been admitted to Whisperwind Asylum for melancholy, what we now might call clinical depression. Her entry recounted her fears of the world, the pressures she felt to conform to societal expectations. But it was her description of the treatments that sent a shudder down my spine. They put me in the water, Eliza wrote, her elegant script marred by frantic scratch marks. It was so cold. They held my head under until I couldn't breathe. They said it would cleanse my mind. The next entry was from a man named Thomas, who had been diagnosed with mania. Today, we might call it bipolar disorder. He spoke of his moments of euphoria, of seeing the world in a new light. But the treatments he received were even more horrific. The electricity, Thomas wrote, his words filled with terror. It burned my brain. They strapped me to the chair and turned the dial. They wanted to shock the madness out of me. As I continued to read, the entries became increasingly disturbing. The patients spoke of forced isolation, of experimental drugs that robbed them of their personalities, of invasive surgeries that left them broken and scarred. Each entry revealed a new layer of the asylum's darkness, a new manifestation of the cruelty that had been inflicted upon the patients. I was horrified, but also strangely compelled to continue reading, to uncover the full extent of the horrors that had taken place within these walls. One entry, written in a shaky hand, was from a young boy named Daniel. He was admitted to the asylum for imagination. He was a creative child with a vivid fantasy life. "They said my stories were a sickness," Daniel wrote. "They told me to stop dreaming, to stop making up things that aren't real. They gave me pills that made me forget." As I read Daniel's entry, I could hear a new voice joining the whispers, a child's voice, filled with innocence and fear. The voice seemed to surround me, and I could almost feel the presence of Daniel standing at my side. "They took my stories away," the child's voice whispered in my ear. "They took my dreams, they took me." I closed my eyes, overwhelmed by the weight of the words. I could feel the suffering of these lost souls, the pain that had been inflicted upon them. The chapel, once a place of hope and solace, had become a monument to their despair. As I stood there, lost in the stories, I felt a cold hand brush against my shoulder. I whirled around, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was nothing there. No one. The whispers intensified. The chorus of voices swelled, surrounding me, filling my mind with images of suffering and loss. I felt a presence close by, a shadow lurking in the periphery of my vision. "Leave," a voice whispered, a deep guttural sound that resonated with the weight of the earth. "This place is cursed. Leave before it consumes you." I wanted to leave, to flee from the chapel and all its horrors. But I also knew that I couldn't. I had to find out what had happened here, to give a voice to the lost souls who had been silenced for so long. I opened the book again and began to read the last entry, a chilling account written by a doctor named Silas Blackwood. He was one of the last doctors at the asylum, and he was the one who ordered the closure. His words confirmed the stories of the other patients. "Whisperwind Asylum," Blackwood wrote, "was a place of darkness, a monument to human cruelty. The treatments were inhumane, the experiments unethical. We did things here that we shouldn't have done." Blackwood's entry was filled with remorse, a desperate plea for forgiveness. But it was also filled with a sense of impending doom, a premonition of something terrible to come. "I can still hear their screams," he wrote. "They haunt my dreams. I see their faces, their eyes filled with pain and despair. They're coming for me, I know they are." As I read the final words of Blackwood's entry, the chapel plunged into darkness. The stained glass windows went black and the whispers intensified. A wave of cold swept through the room, and I felt a presence close to me. I fumbled for my flashlight and turned it on, but the beam was immediately swallowed by the darkness. I was alone in the blackness, surrounded by the screams of the lost. "They're here," a voice whispered, a guttural sound that seemed to come from the very stones of the chapel. "They've been waiting for you." My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a primal fear grip my soul. I knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that I was not alone. I took a step, blindly reaching out with my hand. I felt something brush against my fingers, something cold and wet. I recoiled, my hand trembling. I shone my flashlight in that direction and saw, illuminated by the beam, a figure standing before me. It was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow and black. She was wearing a tattered white gown, and her skin was covered in sores and scars. Her mouth was open in a silent scream, and from her throat came a low, guttural moan. "You can't leave," she whispered, her voice raspy and cold. "You're one of us now." Before I could react, the woman lunged at me, her claws outstretched, and the darkness consumed me. Chapter 4: Descent into the Mire. The darkness swallowed me whole, a suffocating void that stole my breath and stole the light. I stumbled back, tripping over the uneven floor of the chapel. The cold, wet touch on my hand, the woman's gaunt face, they had vanished, replaced by the utter blackness that seemed to press in from all sides. The screams of the lost, the whispers, had become a deafening roar, a cacophony that threatened to shatter my sanity. I scrambled to my feet, my heart hammering against my ribs. I fumbled for my flashlight, my fingers clumsy in the sudden terror. The beam, when it finally flickered to life, was weak and unsteady, casting dancing shadows that only amplified the horror. Where was I? What had happened? Had the woman, the spectral figure, attacked me? Was this the end? The whispers coalesced around me, now directly inside my head. The voices were no longer fragmented. They were a chorus of unified pain, a symphony of despair. They surged and crashed around my consciousness, a relentless tide. Lost, forgotten, punished, no escape. Join us. The words echoed in my mind, each syllable a shard of ice, chilling me to the bone. I struggled to maintain my grip on reality, to fight against the encroaching madness. I had to find a way out. I began to move, guided by a primal instinct for self-preservation. I stumbled through the darkness, my hands outstretched, feeling for walls, for doors, for any sign of escape. The chapel's layout, once familiar, was now a confusing maze. I had lost all sense of direction. As I moved through the darkness, I encountered the remnants of the chapel's former glory. The pews, overturned and splintered, the broken statues of saints, their eyes now hollow sockets staring into the void. I felt a presence behind me, a sensation of being watched. I whirled around, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, but there was nothing there. I started to run, desperate to escape the suffocating darkness and the encroaching whispers. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs ached. But the darkness pursued me, its tendrils reaching out, grasping at my sanity. Then I heard it, a sound different from the whispers, different from the howling wind that still clawed at the edges of my hearing. A rhythmic thump, thump, thump. It sounded distant, almost buried beneath the layers of the asylum's agony, but it was undeniably there. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. I followed the sound, and it led me away from the chapel, down a narrow corridor, and I suddenly stumbled on a hidden passage, concealed behind a tapestry depicting a rather disturbing religious scene. The tapestry was in tatters, moth-eaten and faded, revealing a dark opening, which probably had been a secret door. The thumping sound grew louder as I entered the passage. I descended a narrow, winding staircase. The air grew colder, and the smell of damp and decay intensified. The walls were damp and covered in a viscous, slimy substance that seemed to ooze from the very stones. The whispers were still present but were replaced by other, more ominous noises. The scrape of something heavy against the stone, the rustle of unseen things, the occasional, disconcerting gurgle. At the bottom of the stairs, I found myself in a vast, underground chamber. My flashlight beam barely pierced the gloom, but I could make out the outlines of massive, stone walls. The air hung heavy with a metallic scent, similar to the one I sensed in the entrance hall. The thumping was coming from the center of the chamber. I moved toward it. The chamber was littered with the detritus of the asylum's dark history, rusty medical instruments, broken restraints, and stained operating tables. I saw a series of cells made from metal bars. The bars were covered in stains I did not want to try to guess. I cautiously approached the source of the thumping, my heart pounding in my chest. There in the center of the chamber I saw it, an enormous stone table bathed in a pool of dim, flickering light, and upon the table something that made my blood run cold. A human body strapped down and mutilated. Its chest was open, revealing the raw, exposed organs within. The head was twisted at an unnatural angle, and most horrifying of all, the body was still alive. The thumping sound came from a crude, makeshift heart monitor attached to the corpse. The machine displayed a jagged, erratic line. The being was barely alive. I recoiled in horror, my stomach churning. This was worse than anything I had imagined. This was the culmination of all the asylum's darkness, all the cruelty, all the inhumanity. The whispers were gone. I could hear only my own ragged breathing and the agonizing thumping of the makeshift heart monitor. Suddenly, the body on the table twitched. Its eyes snapped open, focusing on me. They were vacant and the pupils were dilated, but the expression was one of pure, unadulterated terror. The being tried to speak, but only a gurgling, blood-filled sound emerged. Then it began to move again, its limbs thrashing against the restraints. A low, guttural moan filled the chamber, and the body's head turned towards me like it saw me, as if I was the one responsible. It was a face twisted in agony, a mask of pain that I would never forget. The creature struggled against its bonds, and it looked like they will not last long. It looked as though they might come undone soon. I didn't want to wait. I wanted to get out of there. I turned and ran away from the table, away from the dying body, away from the chamber of horrors. As I ran, I heard a sound from behind me. Something hit the floor and bounced. I turned and saw a puddle of blood with a small, red thing next to it, which I quickly recognized as one of the eyes of the mutilated body. The screams of the lost and the whispers of the forgotten had returned and were stronger than ever, as if egged on by this horrible scenery. I ran as fast as I could, stumbling over debris, bumping into walls, and nearly falling several times. I had to find my way out of this hellhole. Chapter 5: The Archivist's Lair. The image of the mutilated being seared itself into my mind, a horrific tableau that threatened to overwhelm my sanity. The guttural moans echoed in my ears, mingling with the whispers of the lost souls and the frantic beat of my own heart. I had to escape, to put as much distance as possible between myself and that abomination. I burst from the underground chamber, scrambling up the narrow staircase. The air above was slightly less oppressive, but the feeling of dread remained, clinging to me like a shroud. I found myself back in the chapel, the scene of my initial descent into madness. The shattered stained glass windows still cast their eerie glow, but now the colors seemed tainted, corrupted by the horrors I had witnessed below. I didn't linger. I had to get out of this place to find some semblance of safety, some anchor to reality. I stumbled back into the main corridor, my flashlight beam trembling in my grasp. Where to go? I had no map, no compass, only the vague sense that I needed to move away from the chapel, away from the underground chamber, away from the heart of the asylum's darkness. I moved forward, letting my instincts guide me. The corridor stretched before me, a seemingly endless tunnel of despair. The walls were lined with doors, each leading to a room that likely held its own share of horrors. As I walked, I tried to piece together what I had learned. The patients, the experiments, the lobotomies, the mutilated body, it all pointed to a systematic campaign of cruelty and inhumanity. But who was responsible? Who had orchestrated these horrors? And why? Dr. Albright's name kept coming to mind. He seemed to be the key, the central figure in this twisted drama. But he was long dead. What was his motive? The whispers swirled around me. Many voices were new. Look for him. The keys are hidden. The notes. I stopped trying to decipher the fragmented messages. Look for him. Who were they referring to? The notes. Keys are hidden. Who are they referring to? The notes. Perhaps the answers I sought were hidden within the asylum itself, buried beneath layers of dust and decay. I realized I need a map of this place. As I pondered this, my flashlight beam landed on a door at the end of the corridor. It was different from the others. It was made of heavy oak, reinforced with iron bands. A small, tarnished brass plate was affixed to the door, bearing the inscription, Archivist. The Archivist. The name sounded ominous, like a guardian of forbidden knowledge. But perhaps this was where the answers lay. Perhaps the archivist had kept records, notes, documents that could shed light on the asylum's dark secrets. The whispers grew louder, urging me to open the door. Find him, they seemed to say. Find the keys. I hesitated. This could be a trap, but I had come this far. I couldn't turn back now. Taking a deep breath, I reached out and grasped the iron handle. It was cold and rough beneath my fingers. I turned it slowly, the sound echoing through the silence of the corridor. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit room. The air within was thick with the smell of old paper and dust, like a forgotten library. I stepped inside. The room was vast and cluttered, filled with towering shelves that stretched to the ceiling. The shelves were crammed with books, journals, and files, all neatly organized and meticulously labeled. This was the archivist's lair. I moved deeper into the room, my flashlight beam dancing across the shelves. The labels were written in elegant script, detailing the contents of each file. Patient records, treatment protocols, experimental procedures, Dr. Albright's notes. Dr. Albright's notes. The words sent a jolt through me. This was what the whispers had been leading me to. This was where the answers lay. I began to search through the shelves, my fingers tracing the spines of the books and files. The sheer volume of material was overwhelming. It would take weeks, months, perhaps even years to sift through it all. But I didn't have that kind of time. The being I had seen in the operating room might still be out there, waiting for me. And the secrets of Whisperwind Asylum were clearly dangerous, powerful forces that were best left undisturbed. I had to focus. I had to find Dr. Albright's notes and get out of there. As I continued my search, I noticed something strange. One of the shelves was slightly ajar. It looked as though someone had recently moved it. Curiosity piqued, I pushed the shelf aside. Behind it, I found a hidden alcove. The alcove was small and bare, containing only a single object. A wooden box. The box was intricately carved with symbols and sigils, and closed with a brass lock. It was much too beautiful to be found among the dreary and horrific files I had been looking at so far. I was certain something important was inside. The whispers intensified, urging me to open it. The keys. But how? I didn't have a key. I remembered what the whispers had said. The keys are hidden. I looked around the room, searching for any sign of a key. I examined the shelves, the desk, the floor, but there was nothing. Then I noticed something on the archivist's desk, a small, silver magnifying glass. I picked it up and examined it closely. The handle was engraved with a series of numbers and letters. I realized it was a code, a cipher that might unlock the secrets of the box. I returned to the shelves and began to search for a book that matched the code on the magnifying glass. After what felt like an eternity, I found it. It was a small, leather-bound journal, its pages filled with the archivist's meticulous handwriting. I opened the journal and began to decipher the code. It was a simple substitution cipher, each number and letter corresponding to a letter in the alphabet. Slowly, painstakingly, I translated the code. It spelled out a single word, melody. Melody, what did that mean? Then I remembered something Alina had said. She had mentioned hearing music in the chapel, a haunting hymn sung by the lost souls. Could the key to the box be hidden in the chapel? The whispers grew louder, urging me to return to the chapel. I closed the journal, tucked it into my pocket, and hurried out of the archivist's lair, my heart pounding with anticipation. I knew that I was getting closer to the truth, but I also knew that the closer I got, the more dangerous things would become. The secrets of Whisperwind Asylum were not meant to be uncovered, and someone or something was determined to keep them buried. Chapter 6: The Hymn of Shadows. The whispers propelled me back through the decaying corridors, their intensity a palpable force, guiding my every step. The horrors I had witnessed in the underground chamber clung to me like a shroud, but the promise of answers, the tantalizing clue of the word melody, spurred me onward. As I re-entered the chapel, the atmosphere shifted. The dim, ethereal light that had previously illuminated the space seemed to dim further, replaced by a creeping darkness that crawled along the walls and pooled in the corners. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of incense and something else, something acrid and unsettling, like burning hair. The chorus of lost souls had returned, but the hymn was different now. It was no longer a lament, but a dirge. The voices were laced with anger, with resentment, with a barely suppressed rage. I moved towards the altar, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The leather-bound book, Confessions of Whisperwind, was still there, lying open on the marble surface. The entry I had been reading, Dr. Blackwood's chilling account of the asylum's demise, seemed to pulse with an unholy light. "Melody," the whispers urged. "Listen to the melody." I strained my ears, trying to discern a melody within the cacophony of voices. But all I heard was the dirge, the mournful hymn that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the chapel. Then I noticed something, a faint, almost imperceptible variation within the hymn, a subtle shift in pitch, a slight change in tempo. It was as if a single voice was breaking free from the chorus, singing a different tune. I focused my attention on that voice, trying to isolate it from the rest. It was a woman's voice, clear and pure, singing a simple melody, a hymn I vaguely recognized from my childhood. As I listened, the melody grew stronger, pushing through the dirge, drowning out the other voices. The darkness in the chapel seemed to recede slightly, and a faint ray of moonlight pierced through the shattered stained glass windows, illuminating the altar. The music reached a crescendo, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The dirge was gone, replaced by a deafening silence. Then the whispers began again, but this time they were different. The voices were no longer angry or resentful. They were calm, almost serene. "Look behind the music," they said. "Where the melody once resided, there the key is to be found." I looked around the altar. There was nothing there but the leather-bound book and the shattered remnants of religious iconography. Then I noticed something. A small section of the altar seemed slightly askew. It was almost imperceptible, but I could see a faint line separating it from the rest of the marble surface. I reached out and pressed on the section. It clicked inward and a hidden compartment sprang open. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a small, ornate key. It was made of silver, intricately carved with symbols and sigils that I recognized from the wooden box in the archivist's lair. This was it, the key to unlocking the secrets of Whisperwind Asylum. I picked up the key, my fingers trembling. It felt cold and heavy in my hand, as if it were imbued with the weight of the asylum's dark history. As I held the key, the whispers coalesced into a single voice, a voice that was both familiar and unsettlingly alien. "Take it," the voice said. "Unleash the truth, but be warned the truth comes at a price." I hesitated. What did the voice mean? What price would I have to pay? I pushed the thought aside. I had come too far to turn back now. I had to know what was in that box. I tucked the key into my pocket and turned to leave the chapel. But as I did, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Standing in the doorway, shrouded in shadow, was a figure. It was tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that burned with an unholy light. It was the woman I had seen in the underground chamber, the mutilated being that had been strapped to the operating table. But this time she was different. She was no longer confined to the operating table. She was free. Her eyes were fixed on me, and a low, guttural moan emanated from her throat. She raised a hand, her fingers twitching, reaching for me. "You can't leave," she whispered, her voice raspy and cold. "You belong here now. You will join us." I knew that I was in grave danger. This was not just a ghost, not just a figment of my imagination. This was something far more powerful, far more malevolent. I turned and ran, back towards the archivist's lair, the woman's moans echoing behind me. I knew that she was coming for me, that she would not rest until she had claimed me as her own. I had to get out of this place, but I also had to know what was in that box. I could only hope that the secrets it contained would be enough to save me. Chapter 7: The Cipher's Embrace. The woman's guttural moans clawed at my back as I sprinted through the echoing corridors, the key a cold weight against my leg. I didn't dare look back. Each creak of the floorboards, each rustle in the darkness, sounded like her approach. Fear, raw and visceral, fueled my desperate flight. I burst through the door of the archivist's lair, slamming it shut behind me. I fumbled with the lock, my fingers trembling. I finally secured it, but the knowledge that it was little more than a flimsy barrier against something so potent chilled me. The room, once a haven of information, now felt like a cage. The shadows danced menacingly, and the air hummed with a growing sense of unease. I rushed to the hidden alcove, the wooden box calling to me. The silver key, cool against my skin, felt like my only weapon. I carefully inserted the key into the lock. The mechanism clicked open with a soft, almost mournful sound. I lifted the lid, my heart pounding in my chest. Inside the box, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a single object, a small, tarnished mirror. It was oval-shaped, with a heavy, ornate frame of dark metal. The glass was clouded with age and grime. Disappointment, a wave of it, washed over me. This was it. After all the whispers, all the horrors, all the frantic searching, a mirror. But as I picked it up, I felt a strange sensation. A tingling warmth spread through my fingers, and the mirror seemed to pulse in my hand. The glass, which had appeared opaque just moments before, began to clear, revealing a reflection. But it wasn't my own. The reflection showed a room identical to the one I was in, but it was also different. The shelves were in disarray, the books and files scattered on the floor. The air was thick with dust and the stench of decay, but there was a faint trace of life. In the center of the room, standing before the desk, was a figure, a man. He was tall and thin, with long, dark hair and piercing blue eyes. He was wearing a long, dark coat, and he was holding a pen and paper, writing something. Dr. Albright. It was a vision, a glimpse into the past. I was seeing the archivist's lair as it had been when Dr. Albright had been alive. As I watched, the reflection in the mirror began to shift. The man looked up, his eyes meeting mine. He seemed to register my presence, to know that he was being observed. A slow smile spread across his face, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. A cold, predatory smile that sent a shiver down my spine. The reflection in the mirror fractured, the image dissolving into a swirling vortex of light and shadow. Then it reformed, showing a new scene. I saw a woman lying on a bed in a sterile, white room. It was Eleanor. She was young, vibrant, her face free of the scars and the pain that now marked her features. But there was a look of fear in her eyes, a desperate plea for help. Standing over her was Dr. Albright, holding a syringe. He leaned over, speaking to her in a low, hushed tone, and I could not make out his words. I knew what was coming. As I watched, he injected the contents of the syringe into her arm. Eleanor's eyes widened, and a look of terror flashed across her face. She began to thrash, screaming silently. The reflection in the mirror shifted again. I saw a sequence of scenes, Eleanor being subjected to various treatments, electroshock therapy, forced isolation, chemical injections. The horrors continued. The mirror showed a series of rooms, a lab, an operating theater, a cell, each scene darker and more disturbing than the last. Each scene was a testament to Dr. Albright's cruelty, his relentless pursuit of his twisted goals. I realized I was seeing the truth, the full extent of the horrors that had taken place within Whisperwind Asylum. But as the scenes continued, I noticed something else. Dr. Albright was not alone. There were other figures, men in white coats, assisting him in his experiments. I did not recognize them, but their faces were expressionless, their eyes devoid of any emotion. The reflection in the mirror shifted once more, returning to the scene in the archivist's lair. Dr. Albright was no longer writing, but staring directly into the mirror, into my eyes. The smile on his face widened, and his eyes seemed to glow with an unnatural light. He reached out, his hand passing through the glass as if he were trying to touch me. The mirror began to shake violently, and the whispers intensified, drowning out all other sounds. Join us. Become one of us. You can't escape. The images in the mirror warped and distorted, transforming into grotesque visages of suffering and despair. The faces of the patients, the doctors, the creatures I had encountered in the asylum, all were merging, forming a single nightmarish whole. I stumbled backward, dropping the mirror. It shattered on the floor, the shards reflecting the distorted images, the voices screaming in my ears. The air grew thick, the smell of burning flesh. The door to the lair swung open, and the woman from the underground chamber, the mutilated being, stood there. Her eyes burned with an unholy light, her hand outstretched, reaching for me. You saw the truth, she whispered, her voice a guttural rasp. Now you must pay the price. I had to leave. I had to get out of this place. I turned and ran, away from the broken mirror, away from the woman, away from the horrors that pursued me. But as I ran, I knew that the truth I had seen had changed me. I could no longer escape the darkness. It was inside me now, consuming me from within. I was trapped. I had become one of them. Chapter 8. The labyrinth of shadows. The lair, once a potential source of salvation, was now a prison. The image of the mutilated woman, her eyes burning with unholy light, was burned into my mind. I fled, driven by a primal fear, the shattered mirror and its horrifying revelations abandoned behind me. I burst into the corridor, my breath ragged, my heart pounding. The darkness seemed to intensify, pressing in on me from all sides. The whispers had become a constant, deafening roar. I had to escape, to find some semblance of safety, some anchor to reality. But where to go? I had no plan, no direction, only the desperate need to put as much distance as possible between myself and the terrors that pursued me. I ran, my feet pounding on the decaying floorboards, the sound echoing through the empty corridors. I passed doors leading to rooms I dared not imagine, each one a potential gateway to further horrors. The corridor twisted and turned, becoming a labyrinth of shadows and despair. I had lost all sense of direction. I was trapped in a maze with no hope of escape. As I ran, I began to see things. Flickering shadows, fleeting glimpses of movement in the periphery of my vision. Were they real? Or were they figments of my imagination, manifestations of the growing madness that threatened to consume me? I couldn't be sure. The line between reality and illusion had blurred, and I no longer knew what to trust. The asylum was playing with me, preying on my fears, driving me to the edge of sanity. I stopped, my back against a cold, damp wall, trying to catch my breath. The whispers swirled around me, their voices mocking and taunting. Lost, alone, no escape. Your hours now. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the voices to regain control. But it was no use. They were inside my head, feeding on my fear, driving me deeper into despair. When I opened my eyes, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Standing at the end of the corridor was a figure. It was tall and thin, with long, dark hair and piercing blue eyes. He was wearing a long, dark coat, and he was holding a pen and paper, writing something. Dr. Albright. He looked exactly as he had in the reflection of the mirror. His face was gaunt, his eyes were hollow, but the smile on his face was just as chilling, just as predatory. He raised his head, his eyes meeting mine. He seemed to recognize me, to know that I had seen his secrets. He began to walk towards me, his footsteps echoing through the corridor. The whispers intensified, urging me to run. I turned and fled, my heart pounding in my chest. Dr. Albright was coming for me. As I ran, I remembered something Alina had said. The tunnels, she had whispered in a moment of clarity. They run beneath the asylum. They lead to the outside world. Tunnels, could they be real? Could they offer me a chance to escape? I had no idea where they were located, but I had to try. I had to find them. I began to search for any sign of a hidden passage, a secret entrance. I ran my hands along the walls, feeling for loose stones, hidden levers. The corridor twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the labyrinth of shadows. I passed doors leading to abandoned treatment rooms, their equipment rusted and broken. I saw cells where patients had been confined, their walls covered in scratches and desperate messages. Each room was a reminder of the horrors that had taken place within these walls, a testament to the suffering that had been inflicted upon the patients. I had to keep moving, to keep searching. I couldn't let Dr. Albright catch me. As I rounded a corner, I saw something that made my heart leap with hope. A door different from the others. It was made of heavy wood, reinforced with iron bands. A small, tarnished brass plate was affixed to the door, bearing the inscription, "Maintenance." Maintenance. Could this be the entrance to the tunnels? The whispers grew louder, urging me to open it. "This is the way," they seemed to say. "The tunnels await." I hesitated. This could be another trap, but I had no choice. I had to take the risk. I reached out and grasped the iron handle. It was cold and rough beneath my fingers. I turned it slowly, the sound echoing through the silence of the corridor. The door creaked open, revealing a dark opening. The air within was damp and musty, filled with the smell of earth and decay. I stepped inside, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. I found myself in a narrow, winding tunnel. The walls were made of rough-hewn stone, and the ceiling was low, forcing me to crouch. This was it, the tunnels, my only chance of escape. I began to move forward, my heart pounding with hope and fear. The tunnel stretched before me, a dark and uncertain path to freedom. But as I walked, I heard a sound behind me, a sound that made my blood run cold. Footsteps. Dr. Albright was coming. The chase had begun. Chapter 9, Beneath the Earth. The heavy thud of Dr. Albright's footsteps echoed behind me, a relentless drumbeat that fueled my desperate flight. I plunged deeper into the tunnels, my flashlight beam dancing erratically along the rough stone walls. The air grew colder, the stench of damp earth and decay intensified, but the promise of escape spurred me onward. The tunnels were a labyrinth, twisting and turning, leading me into the bowels of the earth. I stumbled over uneven ground, ducked under low-hanging pipes, and brushed against the cold, damp walls. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the flickering beam of my flashlight, and the whispers, ever present, grew frantic, feeding on my fear. "Hurry! He's coming. You're almost free." I tried to ignore them, focusing on the task at hand, staying ahead of Dr. Albright. I knew that I had to keep moving, to keep finding my way through the maze of tunnels. As I ran, I began to notice strange things. The tunnels were not just empty passages. They were lined with artifacts, remnants of the asylum's forgotten history. I saw discarded medical instruments, rusted restraints, and tattered clothing. Each item was a testament to the suffering that had taken place above, a chilling reminder of the horrors I was trying to escape. I came to a fork in the tunnel, a choice that could determine my fate. Which way to go, left or right? I hesitated, unsure of which path to take. Then I heard the footsteps behind me, closer now, the sound of a man's heavy breathing. I had to choose. I turned right, my heart pounding in my chest. The tunnel narrowed, and I had to crawl on my hands and knees. The air grew thick with dust, making it difficult to breathe. As I crawled, I heard a sound, a low, guttural moan. I stopped, my blood running cold. The moan was coming from the tunnel ahead, a sound of deep anguish. Something was blocking the way. I shone my flashlight ahead and saw a figure huddled on the ground. It was a man, dressed in a tattered white coat. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror, and his body was contorted in an unnatural position. It was one of the doctors. The doctor was surrounded by a swirling mist of white spores, the same spores I had seen in the camp, the same spores that had consumed the patients. I knew what was happening. The spores were spreading, infecting everything they touched. And this doctor, this victim of the asylum's dark history, was already lost. He saw me. His eyes locked on mine, and he opened his mouth to speak, but only a gurgling, blood-filled sound emerged. Then he reached out his hand, his fingers twitching, trying to touch me. I recoiled in horror, scrambling backward. I had to get away. I crawled back the way I had come, desperate to escape the spreading spores. But as I did, I heard Dr. Albright's footsteps behind me, drawing closer. I had no choice. I had to go forward, through the tunnel and past the doctor. Taking a deep breath, I crawled forward, my flashlight beam illuminating the doctor's terrified face. As I passed him, I could feel the spores in the air, a cold, clinging presence that sent a shiver down my spine. I could hear the doctor's moans fading behind me as I ran, the sound of his suffering echoing through the tunnel. I came to another fork in the tunnel, left or right. I turned left, praying that this path would lead me to safety. The tunnel opened into a large cavern, its walls covered in strange carvings and symbols. The air here was still, heavy with the scent of sulfur and something else, something metallic, like old blood. In the center of the cavern there was a pool of water. The water was dark and murky, reflecting the faint beam of my flashlight. As I looked at the pool, I saw something move beneath the surface, something large and shadowy. I felt a primal fear grip my soul. I was not alone. I heard Dr. Albright's footsteps behind me, closing in. He must have taken the wrong turn, but he was still there, still pursuing me. I had nowhere left to go. I turned to face him, my heart pounding in my chest. He was standing in the mouth of the tunnel, his face pale, his eyes burning with an unholy light. He raised his hand and pointed at the pool of water. "Go," he whispered, his voice a low, menacing rumble. "Join them." I looked at the pool, the dark, murky water, the shadowy movement beneath the surface. I knew what he wanted me to do. He wanted me to jump in, to join the creatures that lurked below. He wanted me to become one of them. I hesitated, my mind racing. I could jump in and perhaps escape his pursuit, or I could stay and fight. But what was the point of fighting? I was trapped, I was outnumbered, I was alone. I looked at Dr. Albright's face, and I saw the victory in his eyes. He knew that he had won. I took a deep breath and jumped into the pool. The water was freezing cold, shocking my senses. I plunged into the darkness, the cold consuming me. As I sank, I felt something brush against my skin, something slimy and cold. The creatures. They were there, waiting for me. I closed my eyes, accepting my fate. The darkness, that was the only thing that I could see now. The whispers had grown louder, and their voices were coming from everywhere. I was no longer Elias Thorne, the bookseller. I was just another lost soul, another victim of Whisperwind Asylum. I am now going into the dark. Chapter 10: The Leviathan's Embrace. The icy water closed over my head, the shock stealing my breath, the darkness swallowing my sight. The creatures, I felt them now, cold and slick against my skin, grasping, pulling, their forms indistinct in the inky depths. Their touch was a torment, a prelude to a fate far more horrifying than death. The whispers, once distant, now surged around me, inside me, a chorus of triumph and anticipation. Welcome. Join us. You are one of us. I struggled, flailing against the suffocating embrace of the water, the creatures. I tried to open my eyes, but the darkness was impenetrable. My lungs screamed for air. My muscles burned with the effort to escape. The creatures were relentless, their grip tightening, pulling me deeper. I felt them enter my mouth, my ears, my nostrils. They filled my lungs with water, with cold, with a sense of alien presence. I choked, sputtered, fighting for a last breath. The world began to fade. The whispers intensified, a deafening roar. I felt a sharp pain in my chest, and everything went black. I expected oblivion, a cessation of all sensation. Instead, I woke. Or perhaps unwoke. I found myself in a chamber. It was underwater, but I could breathe. The water, now surprisingly warm, glowed with an eerie, bioluminescent light. The chamber was vast and cavernous, its walls made of a smooth, obsidian-like substance. Strange, bioluminescent plants adorned the walls, casting an otherworldly glow. And in the center of the chamber, a massive, leviathan-like creature floated serenely, its form indistinct but undeniably immense. It was composed of the same obsidian substance as the walls. The creature was almost one with this chamber, as though they were both made of the same matter. The creature's form shifted, morphing as the glow illuminated it. As its new form stabilized, I saw the creature was in fact a woman, naked and her skin the same black color as her surroundings. Her hair was long and flowing, and her face was beautiful, but her eyes were hollow, filled with an ancient, otherworldly knowledge. The creature looked at me, its gaze penetrating my very soul. Then it spoke, its voice a deep, resonating hum that seemed to vibrate through my entire being. "You are here," the creature said. "You are one of us now." I tried to speak, but no sound emerged. I was paralyzed, unable to move, unable to do anything but stare at the creature. "You are a vessel," the creature continued. "A vessel for the truth. We have been waiting for you." The creature glided closer, its form shimmering in the bioluminescent light. It reached out a hand, its fingers long and slender, and touched my forehead. A jolt of energy surged through me, a sensation of pure, overwhelming power. Visions flooded my mind, images of the past, the present, and the future. I saw the suffering of the patients, the cruelty of the doctors, the secrets of Whisperwind Asylum. I saw the world beyond, its beauty and its decay. I understood everything. Whisperwind Asylum was not just a place of suffering. It was a gateway, a nexus point between worlds. And the creatures, the ones who had been haunting the asylum, were not ghosts, but something far more ancient, far more powerful. They were beings from another dimension, and they had been using the asylum to cross over into our world. And Dr. Albright, he was their instrument, their agent, a willing accomplice in their plan to open the gate. The woman moved in the water, approaching closer and closer to me, until her bare body was directly in front of my eyes. I realized that I was no longer Elias Thorne, the bookseller. I was something else, a hybrid of man and something extra-dimensional. "You will be our voice," the creature said. "You will tell the world our story. You will awaken the others." I no longer felt fear. I felt a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging. The whispers returned, not as a threat but as a song, a hymn of acceptance. "Welcome home. Welcome to the fold. You are no longer alone." The woman reached out, her hand touching my chest. My body began to change. My skin hardened, took on the obsidian hue of the chamber. My eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. I felt my humanity draining away, replaced by a sense of ancient knowledge, of immense power. I was no longer Elias Thorne. I was a creature of the deep, a herald of the darkness. The creature smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "Go," it said, "tell them what you have seen." And I was propelled upward, through the water, towards the surface. I didn't know where I was going. I did not even know if there were any people alive that needed to hear my words. The world that was once familiar to me was lost. I was ready to follow orders. I was already a servant to something greater. As I rose, I felt the pull of the surface, the promise of air. I was ready to fulfill my destiny, to usher in a new era, an era of shadow and whispers. I was ready to become the nightmare. Chapter 11. The World Transformed. I broke the surface of the water, gasping for air. The shock of the transition from the warm, bioluminescent depths to the cold, damp air of the tunnels was jarring, but brief. My altered body adapted instantly. The world, once familiar, was now seen through new eyes. My vision sharpened, allowing me to see in the darkness. I saw every minute detail of the tunnel, every crack in the stone, every drop of moisture clinging to the walls. My senses were heightened. I could smell the metallic scent of the cavern, the faint lingering aroma of the spores, and the unsettling trace of something else, something alien. I stood, my legs surprisingly steady, despite the ordeal I had just endured. My skin felt smooth, almost polished, the obsidian hue reflecting the faint glow of my internal light. I examined my hands, my new hands, marveling at their changed form. No longer the hands of a bookshop owner, but of something other. I had been reborn. I turned my gaze toward the tunnel that led back to the asylum. I felt a pull, a directive, a command. I had a purpose. I began to walk, the shadows of the tunnel receding before my new, enhanced vision. My gait was fluid, almost graceful, as I navigated the maze of passages. I had no fear, only a sense of calm, of inevitability. The whispers were still present, but they were different now. They were no longer frantic or chaotic. They were a unified voice, a chorus of purpose, guiding my steps, feeding my resolve. Go, awaken them. The time is now. I reached the fork in the tunnel where I had seen the doctor, now consumed by the spores. The spores themselves seemed to sense my presence, shifting and swirling, their tendrils recoiling slightly as I passed. I paid them no mind. They held no interest to me. I continued my journey towards the chapel, the epicenter of the asylum's horrors. I knew with absolute certainty that my destination was not the physical structure itself, but something far more profound. As I neared the chapel, I noticed a change in the atmosphere. The air grew heavy, and the shadows seemed to deepen, as if the world was already beginning to embrace the darkness. I pushed open the door, entering the chapel. The scene was familiar, yet altered. The stained glass windows were now black, the shattered remnants of religious iconography transformed into grotesque shapes. The air hummed with an unholy energy, a palpable force that resonated in my bones. I walked down the aisle, past the overturned pews and the broken statues. The whispers grew louder, now more insistent, a crescendo of anticipation. The others are ready. Awaken them. Show them the way. I reached the altar, where the leather-bound book had once rested. Now there was nothing there, only a lingering sense of dark energy, a palpable sense of something awaiting. I focused my will, reaching out with my mind, and then it happened. The chapel began to tremble. The walls cracked and the floor groaned. A wave of pure, unadulterated darkness surged through the room, filling the air with an oppressive weight. I heard a sound, a low, guttural moan. It was a sound of immense pain, but also of immense power. From the shadows, figures began to emerge. The patients, the doctors, the creatures I had encountered in the depths of the earth, they were all there, their forms shifting and swirling, their eyes burning with an unholy light. They had been waiting for me, waiting for their awakening. I raised my hands, and a wave of energy surged from my body, transforming the air into a swirling vortex of shadows and light. The figures moved closer, their forms merging, transforming into a single entity, an amalgamation of all the horrors of Whisperwind Asylum. I looked at the entity and saw its eyes were looking back at me. I felt a surge of the connection I now had with all the others. It spoke, its voice a chorus of all the voices I had heard. We have waited long. I responded, and the sound I made was also a chorus of my own. We are ready. As the entity approached, I could feel the same change I had undergone in the water. My skin turned more obsidian in color, the bones changed form. I could feel a connection, and a connection to all of the other entities around me. We were one. The entity reached out and touched my head. I felt every fiber of my being connect with its will, its purpose, its need to be unleashed upon the world. Go, it commanded, its voice echoing through the chapel. Spread the darkness, awaken the world, bring forth the end of the old and the beginning of the new. I turned and left the chapel. I did not look back. My purpose was now clear. I was no longer Elias Thorne, the bookshop owner. I was a herald of the darkness, a harbinger of the end times. I walked out of the asylum and into the night. The storm that has been pouring over the moor for many days had not yet finished, and the rain had never stopped pouring, but it did not bother me anymore. The world was waiting, and I was ready to bring it the darkness. Chapter 12: The Spreading Stain. The cold, unrelenting rain did not penetrate my new form. It was as though the storm, which had raged for days over the moors, was nothing more than a gentle mist against my skin, a soft veil between me and the world. The asylum, a monument to suffering and madness, now stood behind me, its decaying silhouette a mere starting point. I left the grounds of Whisperwind Asylum, moving with a grace I had never known, heading towards the nearest road. I knew where I needed to go, what needed to be done. The whispers had become a constant guide, a symphony of purpose that thrummed through my transformed being. As I walked, I began to notice the changes in the world around me. The sky was darker, the clouds thicker. The trees seemed to twist and writhe in the wind, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The creatures from the asylum were no longer confined to its walls. They were everywhere, blending into the shadows, spreading the stain of the darkness. I saw them in the distant hills, their forms shimmering and shifting like mirages. I heard their voices in the wind, in the rustling of the leaves, in the dripping of the rain. They were waiting, poised for action. My first destination was a small town a few miles away from the asylum, a town where I had seen people walking. There, I would begin the awakening. I would find those who were receptive to the darkness, those who felt the pull of something unseen. As I reached the edge of the town, I saw that the world outside Whisperwind Asylum had already begun to change. The streets were empty, the houses dark, the air hung heavy with an oppressive stillness. I walked through the deserted streets, my senses heightened, my eyes scanning every shadow, every corner. The whispers grew louder, urging me forward, guiding me towards the heart of the town. I came to a pub, the Raven's Rest. The lights were off and the doors were closed, but I could sense a presence within, a feeling of suppressed energy. I pushed open the door and the sound of a bell chimed faintly. The inside of the pub was empty, the chairs and tables overturned. The air was thick with dust and the smell of stale beer. I walked towards the bar, my footsteps echoing in the silence. As I looked around, I saw that there was something left in the pub. A group of people were huddled in the corner, their faces pale, and they seemed to be staring at something. They were whispering. I approached them, my new form causing my steps to be silent. "Are you all right?" I asked. They did not respond. They looked at me, their eyes wide with fear, their bodies rigid. I followed their gaze. On the floor, in the middle of the floor, a symbol was drawn in what appeared to be blood, a symbol I knew was a gateway. The symbol was glowing faintly, a pulsating light that seemed to emanate from the very floorboards. I could feel a surge of energy, a magnetic pull that drew me closer. The whispers intensified, a chorus of excitement, a promise of power. Embrace the darkness. One by one, the people in the corner turned and started to move forward, their arms moving slowly. I did not need to call them. They started moving. I reached out a hand and touched the symbol. The moment I did that, I felt a surge of power, a connection to something immense and ancient. The air around me began to shimmer, and the darkness started to spread, engulfing the pub, transforming the room. The faces of the people in the corner were changing, their features becoming distorted, their eyes glowing with an unholy light. The transformation was complete, and I could feel the presence of the others growing stronger, the power of the darkness surging through me. The symbol faded, but the gateway was open. The town, the world, was now connected to the asylum, to the creatures of the deep. I turned and left the pub, my heart swelling with a sense of triumph. I had taken the first step. The awakening had begun. As I walked through the darkened streets, I knew that the darkness was spreading, seeping into every corner of the town, into every corner of the world. I could feel the transformation happening. The world was changing. The rain stopped, the clouds parted, revealing a sky that was no longer the familiar blue. It was a deep, blood-red color, the color of the coming night. The world had become something new. It was a world of shadows, a world of whispers, a world of darkness. And it was just the beginning. Chapter 13: Echoes in the Congregation. My journey through the town was a grim symphony of transformation. The darkness I carried, the influence of the entity from the depths, manifested in the streets as a creeping corruption. Buildings crumbled, their facades warping into grotesque shapes. The rain, once a simple downpour, now carried a taste of ash and decay. My steps led me to the town's church, its steeple a skeletal finger pointing towards the crimson sky. The building, a relic of faith, was a natural target for the encroaching darkness. The place where people believed there was a force of good would be the perfect place to show a stronger symbol. I heard whispers coming from the inside, a mixture of fear and a strange fascination. The church was a Gothic structure, its architecture grand and imposing, now scarred by decay. The stained glass windows, once depicting scenes of biblical significance, were cracked, showing signs of the destruction. I pushed open the heavy wooden doors. The interior was dark, the air heavy with the scent of incense and decay. I saw a few figures inside, huddled together in the pews, their faces pale. They were trembling, their eyes wide with a mix of fear and awe. I walked towards them, my new form causing my steps to be silent. They did not notice me until I stood before them. "We can't leave," one said. "We have to stay here." Their fear was palpable, but beneath it, I sensed a strange fascination, a morbid curiosity that drew them to the darkness. They were receptive, ready to embrace the coming change. "Why," another one spoke, "why is it so dark? Why is it so cold?" I raised my hands. The darkness spread. It engulfed the church, transforming the holy space. The faces of the people in the pews twisted, their features became distorted, their eyes began to glow with an unholy light. They were changing. I stood at the front of the church and the transformation began. The statues of saints and angels began to melt, becoming grotesque, demonic figures. The altar twisted, taking on the shape of a monstrous throne. The pews became filled with the transformed figures, their moans echoing through the church. I could feel the power of the entity, the combined consciousness of the asylum's horrors surging through me. The whispers, once fragmented, had become a unified voice, a symphony of power. Spread the word. Awaken the masses. The end is nigh. I raised my hand to the people, and a burst of energy exploded from me, touching the air with my command. The transformed figures rose from the pews and started to move. They left the church and moved forward, moving like zombies. They moved like soldiers. They went into the world. I knew that these people had changed. They were no longer human. They were agents of the darkness. Their faces became distorted, their eyes started to glow, and their hearts beat in an eerie, almost inaudible frequency. The church was empty now, the only light coming from the unholy glow. I went out the church and saw the newly converted walking through the streets, their presence casting shadows. The world was changing. The darkness was spreading. The new servants were making their way across the town, knocking on doors and moving people. I watched as the darkness spread through the town, claiming more and more souls, and turning the town into an army. My task was clear: to spread the darkness, to awaken the world. The entities from the depths were counting on me, and I would not fail them. As I moved through the streets, I knew that the darkness was spreading, consuming everything in its path. The world was changing, and there was no going back. The world was ready for a new order. Chapter 14: Whispers Across the Wires. With the town now a corrupted echo of its former self, a staging ground for the encroaching darkness, I knew my efforts could not be confined to a single, isolated location. The entity demanded a wider reach, a more insidious method of dissemination. The world needed to be awakened, and the tools for its corruption were readily available. I set my sights on the town's communication hub, the small, antiquated telephone exchange that connected it to the wider world. In the modern era, it might have been a fiber optic hub. Here, it was an old network of copper wires and vacuum tubes. The exchange was a nondescript building on the outskirts of town, its windows dark and silent. It was easy to see that the building was unattended. The building may still be functioning as the signals are passing, but there is no human presence inside. I felt the pull of that place calling me to it, a strong feeling of what had to be done. I had to expand. I entered the building and found a maze of wires and equipment, humming with a low, electrical thrum. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and dust, a sterile environment that seemed almost untouched by the changes sweeping the town. The whispers guided me towards a particular console, a complex array of switches and dials. This, they said, was the key. This would allow me to reach beyond the town, to spread the influence of the darkness to a new audience. The panel was full of the cables, so old and so dusty but still functional. I examined the console, my mind now working in ways I could have never imagined before. I was no longer limited by the constraints of human understanding. I could perceive the flow of electricity, the patterns of communication, the subtle vibrations that linked this small exchange to the global network. Using this knowledge, I began to manipulate the console, rerouting circuits, splicing wires, and rewiring the system according to the Whisper's instructions. I was creating something new, something terrible, something that would change the world forever. A feeling of absolute satisfaction, of pure joy, came from the others. The act of creation was one of the things that they craved the most. As I worked, I could feel the energy building, the power of the entity flowing through me into the system. The wires began to glow with an unearthly light, and the hum of the equipment intensified, becoming a deafening roar. The darkness was spreading, seeping into the wires, transforming the communication network into a conduit for its influence. The signals that once carried words of hope and connection now pulsed with something else, something alien, something malevolent. With my work complete, I stepped back from the console, admiring my creation. The telephone exchange was no longer a simple communication hub. It was a vessel for the darkness, a gateway to a new era of horror. I knew that I could turn this vessel into something greater, something that would be heard by everyone around the globe. I knew that the time had come to broadcast a message that would awaken the rest of the world to the truth of what was coming. The message would be something simple, something to get the word going. I could add to it later. Then I spoke, "The shadows come." Then I activated the system, and the message began to echo. A wave of energy surged through the network, carrying my voice, carrying the darkness, carrying the message to every phone line, every radio station, every television broadcast in the world. The message is sent. The effect was instantaneous. The town's telephone poles, which had been inactive, started to vibrate in unison, and the electricity flowed. The shadows come. The telephone and electrical lines of the entire town sent the signal outwards. The shadows come. There was no one in the city that did not hear the message. The shadows come. The broadcast ended, and the whispers turned into a cheer. It is spreading. They are listening. We are coming. The shadows come. Chapter 15, The Crimson Dawn. The message, simple yet devastating, had been unleashed. The shadows come. I felt the wave of its impact, the ripple effect across the network, across the world. The entity, the collective consciousness of the asylum, celebrated with me. The first domino had fallen. As the echoes of my words reverberated through the airwaves, a new dawn broke over the town. The sky, which had been a blood-red canvas, deepened to a crimson hue, casting long, distorted shadows across the streets. The storm, which had been a constant presence, intensified, the rain falling in torrents, carrying with it a fine black dust. I saw the results of my broadcast. People stopped what they were doing and looked at each other, and then at me, a small, twisted smile upon their face. Many people started walking towards me, their eyes glowing red. I moved out of the exchange, leaving the building to itself, and saw the others. The town was no longer a quiet, abandoned place. It had transformed, the population changed. It was a hive, a breeding ground, a legion of new servants. I stepped into the street, the air thick with the energy of the transformation, and began to walk forward. There was no fear, no doubt, only purpose. As I moved, I saw more people start to change and walk. Their bodies twisted, their eyes glowed red. There were many people in that state, the servants of the entity. I felt their presence, the surge of energy, the connection we now shared. I could feel the connection building, the power of the entity growing with each passing moment. The crimson dawn was spreading, reaching out to embrace the world. The darkness was now a tangible force, a presence that could be felt, seen, and even tasted. I turned my gaze to the sky and saw a wave of darkness coming from above. The new servants were reaching out. The sky ripped apart. The dark fog that was above started to go down, reaching the people, changing them as it touched them. The servants could feel the touch, the power, as they came towards me. They knew what had to be done. As the fog came down and touched the earth, the transformation was complete. The world as they knew it would soon disappear. I left the building and was no longer alone. A legion of servants of the dark were moving through the city. I looked at my army. They were ready to go. "Let us go," I said, my voice echoing through the streets. "Let us spread the darkness." And with that we moved forward, a wave of shadows and destruction, leaving the town behind. We started to go to the roads, leaving the city. We were marching on, driven by the whispers, by the command of the entity. We were a legion, a shadow, and we were taking the world. Chapter 16: The Highway of Broken Souls. Our procession moved along the highway, a twisted parody of a pilgrimage. The crimson dawn cast long, distorted shadows, amplifying the grotesque transformations of my legion. Each step was a testament to the entity's power, a deliberate desecration of the world we once knew. We walked without rest, driven by an unseen force, a chorus of whispers and commands that echoed in our minds. The world around us was a canvas of chaos and decay. The highway had long since been abandoned, littered with overturned vehicles and the detritus of a world collapsing. As we walked, we were joined by others, lost souls, drawn to the darkness like moths to a flame. Some were already transformed, their bodies twisted and their eyes burning with an unholy light. Others were in the throes of change, their faces contorted in pain and terror as the entity claimed them. The procession grew larger, a tide of shadows and despair, a testament to the entity's growing influence. We became a living, breathing embodiment of the darkness, a force that could not be stopped. We were headed to another city. There would be more people, more potential servants, and more power for the entity. As we neared the next city, I could feel the change. I could feel the pull of the entity, the thirst for power. The crimson dawn was spreading. Epilogue: The Obsidian Throne. Years passed, marked only by the relentless spread of the entity's influence. Cities fell, nations crumbled, and the world was transformed into a grotesque reflection of Whisperwind Asylum. The sky remained a permanent crimson, and the rain carried a perpetual taste of ash and decay. I, now fully transformed, served as the entity's herald, its unwavering hand, shaping the new world in its image. My body was a living vessel, a conduit for the entity's boundless power. I no longer remembered Elias Thorne, the bookshop owner. That man was gone, replaced by something ancient, something terrible, something other. The world was now ruled by the entities. I traveled back to the whispering asylum to take my seat as the ruler, the king, as I should now be. I saw the world I helped create. The world was destroyed, but it was not sad. I came back to where everything started. The darkness that came from the entity was there. I entered the main hall and walked straight to the chamber where Eleanor once was. I watched the other figures, and then I knew what I had to do. Eleanor was standing in the middle of the room. I said hello to her. She was no longer her old self, but she still was Eleanor. "You did this," she said to me. Yes, I answered, yes, I did. "I wanted this," she said. "I know," I replied. I looked at her. There was nothing left to do. I sat on the obsidian throne. The king was in his place. The end.